Welcome back to Mad Medicine. In this video, we're going to be discussing hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Now, if you haven't already done so, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel because we're going to be posting brand new videos on medical topics every single day. These videos are meant to be educational and informative and also free so that everyone has access to them. So you subscribing will really help us out and will really help us grow the channel. So with that being said, let's discuss these two topics you need to know for your examinations. We're going to first start off by talking about cellular adaptations. Our cells are under a lot of stress at all times, and that's all because of the environment that they are in. Often, the environment that they're in is not forgiving. It's a very stressful and toxic environment, and it can put a lot of pressure on our cells. One example of this is the stomach lining. Our stomach acid is primarily composed of hydrochloric acid, and this is a very acidic compound. Our stomach lining is constantly being eroded away because of this compound, so that environment is very stressful. And our cells in that environment have developed several adaptations to be able to withstand that acid to a certain level. Now, although our cells are under a lot of stress, our organs are generally under a state of homeostasis, and that's very important to understand because they have the ability to withstand a certain amount of stress. But after a certain amount, they're going to get damaged and they're going to be destroyed or their function is going to go down. Now, the change in our cells or in our organs, the adaptations specifically are going to be based off of the type of stress as well as the severity of the stress that's being placed upon them. The type of stress, whether it's a physical, chemical, biological stress, and the severity, how much stress is being placed upon them, is going to end up determining what the adaptation is and how much or to what extent the adaptation occurs. And an increase in stress often will lead to the growth of an organ. An organ might hypertrophy or go through hyperplasia in order to accommodate that stress so it doesn't get damaged. Remember, this is a cellular adaptation technique. Now, there are two main types of growth adaptations that we're going to be discussing in this video. Like we said, there are hypertrophy and hyperplasia. And you need to know both of these mechanisms very well. And you need to have a good understanding or a good grasp of these mechanisms. So let's talk about hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is a type of growth adaptation that occurs due to the increase in the size of the cells of an organ. So in this case, let's say you have a cell right here. Okay, this is a normal cell, blah, 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 whatever. Okay, it's filled with the nucleus and, mitochondria, et cetera, et cetera. That's the cell. When it undergoes a type of stress that it perceives as it being too much for its normal day-to-day function, this cellular adaptation mechanism is going to be hypertrophy. And during that phase or during that adaptation, the cell is not going to increase in the number of cells, it's going to increase the size of the cell. So instead of it being a small cell, it's going to be relatively big. Okay, now the thing to remember is that the number of cells is still the same in this condition. You're still going to have the same amount of cells, you're still going to have the same everything else, except the actual size is going to grow. So how does this actually happen? Essentially, it involves gene activation. And this is very important, this is very key to remember, that hypertrophy focuses on gene activation in order to produce proteins and organelles. You got to fill up this space somehow, right? You can't just have a cell grow in size and it be like 99% cytoplasm. That's actually a sign of cellular damage that can occur. So in order for the cell to function properly in such a large amount of space, you're going to fill it up with organelles to accommodate that stress and to be able to produce whatever compounds our cells or our organs or our body needs to withstand the stress being placed upon them. Only very few organs are actually going to undergo hypertrophy. That's very important because hypertrophy doesn't happen in every single organ, and very few organs will only undergo hypertrophy, meaning they will not undergo hyperplasia along with it. They will undergo hypertrophy by itself. We're going to be discussing hyperplasia, and it's very important to understand the differences between the two because this will make a lot of things more clear down the road when you're being tested on the cellular mechanism that's being used by our body to accommodate stress. Again, this is a type of growth adaptation where you have an increase in the number of cells in an organ. So we're going to remember this by just reviewing really quickly. When we're talking about hypertrophy, this is going to be an increase in the size of the cell. In hyperplasia, you are going to have an increase in the number of cells. So again, just to draw it out, this is one cell. In order to accommodate the stress, our body will create several, or they'll just increase the number of cells in that organ to be able to accommodate that stress, right? So this is like the same cell, just a more an increase in the number of that cell, right? The size might be exactly the same as the previous picture I drew where we had a hypertrophied cell. The important thing to remember is that in hyperplasia, all of this is happening from stem cells. That is the key driving factor. Again, we're going to write this so you remember what is happening. So if you have hypertrophy, this is all being driven by gene activation. Our genes are being activated, and that is causing our cells to produce more proteins and to produce more organelles. In hyperplasia, you don't have gene activation necessarily occurring. You actually have activation of the stem cells specifically. And these stem cells are going to increase the number of cells by producing more cells in general. And a normal example, okay, meaning this happens normally, of hyperplasia is the uterine lining during the menstrual cycle. So during the menstrual cycle, we know that the uterine lining specifically in the uterus is going to grow. And along the menstrual cycle, it grows, right? And all of this growth that is occurring due to hyperplasia. This hyperplasia is then going to halt at the end of the cycle, and during menses, it's going to shed. The uterine lining sheds, right? And that's where you get the bleeding and the period occurs. Well, at this area, you have apoptosis of those cells. The only way you can have apoptosis of these cells is that if these cells are growing in the number. Because if they weren't growing in the number, right, and they were only growing in size, after a certain amount of periods, after a certain amount of menstrual cycles, females would not have a uterus left over because there's no cells left over. Instead, because they have stem cells essentially within the uterine lining, they're able to produce more and more stem cells, and then at the end of the cycle, apoptose those cells, and the cycle can start all over again. That is a normal example of hyperplasia. You do have pathologic hyperplasia as well. And in pathologic hyperplasia, this can lead to dysplasia, and then if unsolved or uncorrected, it can lead to cancer. And there are two main types of lesions you need to commit to memory and you need to remember because they're going to be brought up either on your tests or in the wards. The first type is going to be endometrial hyperplasia that can lead to endometrial carcinoma. This is an example of pathologic hyperplasia that leads to cancer. So endometrial hyperplasia is a type of dysplasia that we're discussing. Okay, this is not normal. It should not be happening. Essentially, this happens during a postmenopausal woman where their endometrial lining should not be growing because they've gone through menopause already. And in this case, this is a type of dysplastic lesion, and this dysplastic lesion, if left uncorrected, will lead to carcinoma. This is the first type of pathologic hyperplasia you need to know because it causes a lot of problems. The key thing to remember is that this is a type of hyperplasia that leads to cancer, but there are also benign pathologic hyperplasias, and this is the exception that you need to commit to memory, like I was saying. Benign prostatic hyperplasia, aka BPH. Benign prostatic hyperplasia is a type of lesion where the prostate in a male grows and it goes to hyperplasia, and it can cause several adverse, effects on a male's reproductive system, on a male's urine flow, and just many other issues can occur. It can lead to hydronephrosis due to back pressure buildup. This is definitely pathologic. The exception to the rule occurs here when you understand that BPH cannot lead to prostate cancer. This is not a precursor lesion, so that you will not have prostate cancer occurring due to BPH. So these two examples are very high yield, and you just need to commit them to memory, and you need to remember it because you could get tested on it or you could get pimped on it on the wards. Now, the main thing you need to remember, or one of the main things you need to remember, is that hypertrophy and hyperplasia often happen together. These are mechanisms of cellular adaptation that occur together in order for cells and our organs to be able to withstand the pressures and the stressors that are being placed upon them. Example of this combined cellular adaptation mechanism is the uterus lining during pregnancy. Now remember, we talked about it during the menses and how during the menstrual cycle you have to actually grow the number of cells in order to accommodate the uterus. But during pregnancy, a different thing is happening. The female body, especially the female uterus during pregnancy, has to accommodate a 7 to 8 pound foreign object along with the amniotic fluid and the placenta. And the only way it's going to be able to accommodate that is not only growing in the size of the cells, right, so that the cells can hold all that liquid, but that's going to limit itself after a certain limit, right? After a certain amount, it's going to limit the size that you can have of the uterus. So the way the female body goes around that is by also increasing the number of cells. By doing this together, the uterus is able to expand drastically and just grow like 100 times the size of its normal size in order to accommodate that little baby that's going to come out. So that's what we have right here. This is all for accommodating the fetus. By growing the size and the number of cells, you can accommodate the fetus and have a healthy baby grow and live inside the mother to be ready to be born. The exception to this rule, the rule that hypertrophy and hyperplasia often happen together, is in permanent tissue. In permanent tissue, you only have hypertrophy, this cellular adaptation mechanism going on. And the reason why is that you have no stem cells. And we'll come back to that in a second. But the three main types of permanent tissues you need to understand are cardiac myocytes, skeletal muscles, and nerves. Okay, again, this is one of the high yield components of this lecture you need to remember completely. Okay, so why are these three tissues permanent tissues? Essentially, you have no stem cells in these tissues. And you should know that because if you damage your nerves, the nerves aren't going to grow back. If you damage your muscle, it's not going to grow back. It's going to hypertrophy when you work out, yes, but it's not growing in the number of cells because there are no stem cells. The cardiac myocytes, if it get damaged, they're not going to grow back. They're not going to regenerate because there are no stem cells. Therefore, you cannot undergo hyperplasia in these types of cells, in these types of tissues. You can only undergo hypertrophy. And that is very important to remember. These three types of tissues only undergo, I'm going to write this for you guys so you guys remember it, is hypertrophy. Okay? Hypertrophy is a key mechanism they use to adapt to any stress that's being placed upon them. And this is a classic example of hypertrophy, left ventricular hypertrophy, right? LVH. In the left ventricle, when it is placed under a significant amount of stress, the thickness of the left ventricular wall will increase in order to accommodate whatever stress is being placed upon it. And that's what's being shown right here. You can see this wall thickness is significantly larger than this one right here. Hence, you have left ventricular hypertrophy happening and not hyperplasia. And that's why I left this title on purpose so I can cross out hyperplasia and help you stick this concept into your mind better. Hypertrophy is what is happening in this photo. With that being said, that's everything you need to know about hypertrophy and hyperplasia, especially how they relate to cellular adaptations. As always, don't forget to subscribe to our channel because your support really means a lot to us. Thank you for watching.